Some people are better suited for simpler work, Miss Chen. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before the hospital's most decorated patient went into cardiac arrest. Sarah Chen moves through Seattle General's ICU in Atlanta with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked under far worse conditions than fluorescent lights and linoleum floors. The night shift nurse keeps a pair of worn combat boots in her locker, tucked behind the spare compression stockings and the bottle of hand cream she never uses. The boots are scuffed leather, faded blood stains on the laces, a gift from a child she pulled from rubble in Bagram 20 years ago. She never explains them to curious colleagues who notice the boots and ask. Some questions don't need answers. Her shift begins at 2,200 hours. The ICU hums with the familiar percussion of monitors and ventilators, a rhythm she could navigate in absolute darkness. Sarah moves from room to room, her movements economical, her hand steady as surgical steel. She checks vitals on 14 patients tonight. She counts them the way she counted casualties. 1, 2, 3. 14 souls under her watch until morning. Room for 47 is at the end of the East Corridor. The general waits there, recovering from what the official file calls a training accident. Catastrophic injuries. Third-degree burns across his chest and shoulders. Compound fracture of the left femur. Traumatic brain injury with resultant mutism. 38 years old and silent since the helicopter went down. Sarah had known he was coming. The message came through the classified number buried in her old Pentagon contact list, a phone she kept in the freezer behind ice cream boxes. Master Chief. We need you to monitor a patient. Room for 47. Seattle General. Atlanta. You'll be working as a civilian nurse. 3 months. Maybe 4. This is unofficial. She never asked who the general was. She never asked what kind of accident produces those injuries in a controlled environment. She had learned, in her first tour as a Special Forces medic in 2004, that some questions came with prices too high to pay. She took the assignment instead. The general's eyes track her movement the moment she enters his room. Dark eyes. Alert. Present. The eyes of someone still very much a soldier, even in a hospital gown with 2 4s running and a catheter draining dark urine into a collection bag. His right arm is immobilized in a sling. His left leg is in traction. But his eyes follow her with the intensity of someone recognizing a ghost. Sarah doesn't acknowledge the recognition. She checks his chart first, always the chart. Vitals stable. Pain management adequate. Surgical sites clean. The medications are listed in clean hospital handwriting, each dose documented, each time stamp precise. She cross-references the pharmacy records on the computer terminal outside his room. The doses match. Everything aligns. Except it doesn't. Sarah notices the discrepancy while reviewing the anticoagulant protocol at 2,347 hours. The chart in her hands, the paper version Caldwell prefers, the one he still updates by hand because he distrusts the digital records, shows a higher warfarin dosage than what the pharmacy dispensed. 5 milligrams per the chart. 3 milligrams in the bottle delivered to the unit. The gap is exactly 2 milligrams per dose, compounding over 11 days. The kind of gap that is easy to miss if you're not looking. The kind of gap that takes precision to create. Sarah's jaw tightens. Not a tremor. Not visible. Just a single muscle contracting once beneath her skin, barely perceptible. She reads the chart again. The handwriting is not Caldwell's, his script is looping and confident. This is someone else. Someone trying to match hospital documentation style without mastering the flourish. The medication alteration is deliberate. She has seen deliberate before. She has seen it in Kandahar when a Taliban operative poisoned the village well. She has seen it in Fallujah when an IED was placed in a playground at 0600 hours because the insurgents counted on the children arriving at 0800 hours. Deliberate has a signature. And this signature screams. She walks to the medication cabinet, a locked steel box that only night shift nurses and the pharmacy tech can access. The cabinet smells like plastic and antiseptic, and the fluorescent light above it flickers in the way that makes her think of the generator rooms at FOB Shank. She finds the warfarin vial. The label is pristine. No irregularities. The dose inside matches what was documented in the pharmacy system. 3 milligrams. Someone altered the paper chart without altering the actual medication. Someone wanted the chart to reflect a higher anticoagulant dosage than what the general was actually receiving. Someone wanted documentation of medications he was never given. Someone wanted a paper trail that showed negligence, incompetence, or worse, intentional misdosing that would lead to catastrophic bleeding during surgery. The surgery is scheduled for 0800 hours. 14 hours away. The general's femur reconstruction. The procedure Caldwell has been planning for 2 weeks, the surgery that will require the patient to be completely anticoagulated to prevent clot formation during the procedure. Sarah stands very still in the medication room. The fluorescent light continues its irregular flicker. Somewhere on the unit, a ventilator alarm sounds 3 times and then goes silent. The night nurse in room for 44 has cleared it. Everything is normal. Everything is fine. Everything is perfectly ordinary except for the fact that someone just tried to create conditions for a medical catastrophe. She closes the medication cabinet and returns to the general's room. He is sleeping, his breathing shallow, his right hand, the one not immobilized, resting atop the white cotton blanket. Even asleep, he looks like a soldier. Muscle memory doesn't fade. Discipline doesn't dissolve. Some people carry their service in their bones, and the general carries it like a uniform. Sarah pulls up the digital pharmacy records on the bedside computer. The system timestamp shows every dispensation. The 3 milligram doses, documented consistently, every 8 hours for 11 days. The paper chart that sits in Caldwell's drawer shows 5 milligram doses. The gap is 12 total doses. 60 milligrams of anticoagulant, unaccounted for, documented but not delivered. The quarterly audit begins in 19 days. Sarah knows this because she has been documenting everything, the billing codes, the phantom consultations, the kickback scheme that Caldwell has been running for 18 months with 3 board members. Her charts are meticulous. Her documentation is precise. The kind of paperwork that makes auditors smile and prosecutors salivate. The kind of trail that, once exposed, brings down entire departments. Dr. Caldwell had no idea that the night shift nurse he dismissed this evening, the one with the limp and the accent and the too careful attention to detail, was creating the evidence that would end his career. He had no idea that her meticulous charting wasn't perfectionism. It was surveillance. And the general in room for 47 wasn't a patient recovering from a training accident. The general was the mission. And the medication alteration was a weapon. Sarah sits in the chair beside the general's bed, the one reserved for family members during visiting hours. She pulls her phone from her scrub pocket and types a text to the classified number. The words are sparse. Coded. Medication discrepancy noted. Chart versus pharmacy. Warfarin protocol compromised. Surgery scheduled 0800. Awaiting instructions. The response comes 47 seconds later. 1 line. Maintain position. Package arriving before dawn. Sarah pockets the phone and watches the general sleep. His left hand twitches occasionally, phantom pain, probably, or dreams of things that happened before the helicopter went down. She doesn't wake him. She has learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for a warrior is let them rest. Let them dream of something other than fire and blood and the sound of rotor blades screaming against gravity. The clock reads 010 for hours. The ICU is quiet now. The night shift is in that deep trough of the early morning when the world seems paused, when even the monitors seem to breathe more softly. Sarah makes her rounds again, room for 40, room for 41, room for 43, room for 45, checking vitals, adjusting for rates, documenting everything in the careful script that has become her signature. At 0155 hours, Dr. Caldwell appears at the nurse's station. This is unusual. Dr. Caldwell works day shift. Day shift means prestige, business lunches, golf matches with hospital administrators. Night shift is beneath him. But tonight he is here, and his presence makes the air pressure change, like a storm system moving in across open water. He walks toward her with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. "Miss Chen." His voice is smooth as oil over still water. "The General's chart. You made some notations." Sarah doesn't look up from the computer. "Vital stable. No change from afternoon assessment." "That's not what I mean." Caldwell moves closer. His cologne arrives before he does, expensive, sharp, the kind of scent that costs more than her monthly rent. "Your attention to detail. It's admirable, truly. But some people are better suited for simpler work, Miss Chen. Medication verification, patient hygiene, basic monitoring. These are valuable contributions. Specialized interpretation of drug protocols? That's beyond your scope." His voice contains a warning. A threat wrapped in condescension. Sarah can hear the message underneath the words, "Stop noticing things. Stop documenting. Stop creating the paper trail that will expose him." She finally turns to face him. Her eyes are very dark. Her face is perfectly composed, no anger, no fear, no reaction at all. Just a nurse at the end of a night shift, looking at her supervisor. "I follow the protocols, doctor." "Of course you do." He smiles. It's the smile of someone accustomed to winning every negotiation. "But protocols are written for average staff. You've shown such promise on the basics. Why stretch yourself? Stay in your lane, Miss Chen. Everyone's happier that way." He turns and walks back toward the stairwell without waiting for a response. That is how conversations work when you hold institutional power. You speak, the other person listens, and you leave. You don't need acknowledgement. You don't need agreement. You need obedience. And Caldwell fully expects his message to land precisely as intended. Sarah watches him descend the stairs. Her hands are steady on the keyboard. Her breathing hasn't changed. The trembling you might expect isn't fear. It's restraint. It's the muscle memory of every moment she's ever held back, every insult she's swallowed, every time she's let someone underestimate her because the mission required it. She returns to the medication cabinet and photographs every vial of warfarin. Then she photographs the paper chart with the altered dosages. Then she photographs the digital pharmacy records showing the actual dispensed amounts. Each image goes to the classified number, encrypted and time-stamped. The evidence accumulates like ammunition in a magazine. The first light of dawn is still 3 hours away. The general is sleeping. The ICU breathes on. And somewhere in Atlanta, Dr. Caldwell goes home to his expensive house, convinced that he has successfully intimidated the night shift nurse into silence. He has no idea what's coming. Thursday morning arrived with the precision of surgical lights flickering on in an operating room. Dr. Caldwell swept into the ICU at 7:19 a.m. with 15 residents trailing behind him like a school of fish following a shark, their white coats pristine, their notepads ready, their expression still soft with the arrogance of people who hadn't yet learned what they didn't know. For attending physicians flanked him, colleagues who'd learned long ago that agreeing with Caldwell was safer than questioning him. The general lay in his bed, chest rising and falling with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, his dark eyes tracking the group's entrance. Sarah was at the medication dispensary 3 feet away, her hand steady as she verified the morning doses against the electronic chart, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket at precisely the same angle it had been for the past 8 years. Caldwell approached the bedside with the care plan in his hands, holding it at arm's length like contaminated evidence. "This," he announced, his voice echoing off the tile walls and bouncing back with the force of authority, "is what happens when we lower our standards." He paused, letting the word settle into the residents' brains like sediment. Nurse Chen here has decided that protocol doesn't apply to her. Perhaps in whatever country she learned medicine, this passes for acceptable care. The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt them like tiny cuts, precise and deliberate. Two residents exchanged glances, their mouths twitching upward. She continued entering vitals into the bedside computer, her spine straight, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Her knuckles whitened on the keyboard for exactly one breath, then released. The mask held. It always held. I've renamed this approach the Chen protocol, Caldwell continued, warming to his audience now, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer who discovered he had the room's attention. It's what you do when you want to get sued into oblivion. Nervous laughter rippled through the group like the aftershock of artillery fire. One resident actually wrote something down on his notepad, what, Sarah couldn't imagine. There was nothing to document except that the general's vitals were stable, his surgical site clean, his medication regimen exactly as prescribed by protocol. But documentation wasn't the point. Humiliation was. Caldwell was establishing his narrative before the audit, before the quarterly review, before anyone could question why a night shift nurse's meticulous charting had begun to contradict his own orders. The group moved on, Caldwell already moving toward the next patient, already dispensing wisdom to residents who had no idea they were standing next to a man with his hands in institutional pockets, pulling strings that went all the way up to the hospital board. Sarah waited 3 full minutes before she moved, giving them time to drift far enough that no one would notice her trajectory. She checked the general's 4 lines, verified the ventilator settings, and whispered words that only he could hear, "I'm still here." His eyes tracked her face. That was all the acknowledgement either of them could afford. By afternoon, the vending machines on the 3rd floor had become a staging ground. Sarah approached them at 2:15 p.m., needing water, needing a moment away from the ICU's fluorescent glare, needing to remember that she still knew how to breathe normally. 3 residents leaned against the wall beside the machines, Marcus, Chen's junior by 4 years and running on resentment that everyone could see but no one acknowledged, and 2 others whose names Sarah had never bothered to learn. She inserted a dollar bill into the machine. The mechanical whir of dispensing filled the silence. "Priest," Marcus said, affecting an accent that bore no resemblance to anything Sarah actually sounded like, but that made the other 2 laugh anyway. "I must check the patient now. Very important. I am super nurse." His voice dripped with mockery, each word stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. The others laughed, not the genuine kind of laughter, but the kind that came from relief at not being the target. Sarah retrieved her water bottle without changing expression. She did not turn to look at them. She did not acknowledge that they'd spoken. Her face remained a mask of such perfect neutrality that it was almost a weapon. "Chen protocol strikes again," another resident added, his voice still riding the wave of the first joke. She turned and walked away, her gait steady despite the limp that pulled at her left leg, a souvenir from a Black Hawk crash in the Hindu Kush 9 years ago, an injury that had officially retired her from field work and mysteriously placed her in Seattle General's night shift rotation under a very carefully constructed legend. Her composure didn't crack. Not in the hallway. Not in the stairwell. Not as she moved back toward the ICU with her shoulders squared and her breathing measured. The mask held because the mask was all that stood between her mission and catastrophe. If she flinched, if she showed anger, if she let them see that their words had landed, then Caldwell would know he was close to breaking her. And if he knew she was close to breaking, he might accelerate his timeline. The medication chart. The altered dosage. The procedure scheduled for tomorrow that would kill the mute general if she didn't find a way to stop it. That evening, as the shift wound down and the ICU settled into its quieter rhythm, Caldwell appeared at the nurse's station like a storm front rolling across a clear sky. 2 security guards flanked him, their presence a statement more eloquent than any words could be. His voice dropped to a register that was somehow more dangerous than shouting. "Your charting is under review, Nurse Chen." The way he said her name made it sound like an indictment. "One more deviation from protocol, and these gentlemen will escort you out. Are we clear?" Sarah met his eyes and nodded once, a single movement of acknowledgement that gave him nothing else to work with. Her face revealed nothing. Her hands hung steady at her sides. But the security guards were looking at her with the kind of pity reserved for people who don't know they're already beaten. Caldwell turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against tile, already victorious in his own mind because he didn't understand that she was still breathing, still thinking, still planning. The security guards drifted back to their station. Sarah finished her charting, documented the evening vitals with the same meticulous precision that had already made Caldwell nervous, and clocked out at 11 p.m. The drive home took 23 minutes. The house was dark except for the kitchen light she'd left on for herself. But she didn't go to the kitchen. She went to the bedroom closet where the worn combat boots sat on the shelf, their leather cracked and sun-faded, their laces still tied from the last time they'd been worn in a place where sand got into everything and never came out. She picked them up and held them against her chest, and that's when she went to the supply closet at the hospital at midnight, because the closet was the only place where no one could see her except the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in glass. The supply closet smelled like bleach and industrial cleaner, like 1,000 small sterile moments compressed into metal shelving and white plastic bottles. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool metal, and for exactly 3 breaths, she allowed her hands to tremble. The shaking was precise and controlled, not panic, but the release of tension that had been building behind her ribs all day, the kind of trembling that came from holding yourself together with pure will. 1 breath. 2. 3. Then she pulled out her phone, the encrypted one that looked like a standard burner to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Her Navy intelligence handler had left a message in the classified channel, Caldwell accelerating, "He knows I'm close to something," she typed back. "Audit in 11 days. He's moving the timeline." She hit send and waited in the darkness of the supply closet for a response that would either tell her to abort the mission or tell her to hold position, and while she waited, she thought about a 6-year-old boy with dark eyes and trust etched across his face, and she thought about a man in a hospital bed upstairs who couldn't speak but whose eyes never stopped tracking her movements, and she thought about the combat boots that smelled like memories of fire and dust and the weight of other people's children in her arms. The handler's response came through 2 minutes later, "Do not break cover. Audit is in 11 days. Extraction contingency only." But the problem with extraction contingencies was that they only worked if you were willing to extract alone, and Sarah had already made a promise 20 years ago to a boy she'd pulled from rubble, a promise that she would be there if he ever needed her again. The medication chart had been altered. She'd seen the digital signature, the buried initials, the dosage change that would cause massive internal bleeding if the general underwent any procedure more invasive than a blood draw. Caldwell had signed off on everything. And tomorrow, the general was scheduled for a routine chest drainage procedure that would transform him from a recovering patient into a casualty. She pressed her forehead against the metal one more time, breathing in the smell of bleach and sterile silence, and then she stood up, pocketed her phone, and walked out of the supply closet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they always did, like they would keep buzzing no matter what happened next, and Sarah Chen, Master Chief Petty Officer, Classified Operative, Night Shift Nurse, clocked back in at 12:01 a.m. and headed back to the ICU where the general waited in the dark, his eyes open, his trust absolute, his vulnerability complete. The observation gallery at Seattle General was separated from the surgical suite by soundproof glass, but Sarah could read the monitors as clearly as if she were standing at the table. She stood motionless, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, just another nurse checking on a patient's progress. The gallery was empty except for a surgical resident scribbling notes in the corner, someone too junior to recognize that the woman beside him was not there by accident. Dr. Caldwell entered the surgical suite like he was walking onto a stage. His movements carried the theatrical confidence of a man who had never faced consequences, a surgeon whose reputation preceded him into every room like a personal herald. Sarah watched him approach the table where the general lay draped in sterile blue, the mute Special Forces officer's body already open to the world in preparation. Caldwell's gloved hands moved with practiced precision as he positioned himself at the surgical field, his attending physicians flanking him like courtiers. The anesthesiologist checked monitors. The scrub nurse counted instruments. Everything proceeding with the mechanical efficiency of a procedure that had been performed 1,000 times. The first incision was deliberate and clean. Within 3 seconds, the surgical field flooded with blood. Not the controlled seep of a properly managed bleed, this was catastrophic hemorrhage, as if someone had opened a valve in the general's chest cavity. Blood pooled in the surgical field faster than the suction could handle it, cascading across sterile drapes, spilling over the edges of the table. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had known it was coming. Her handler had warned her? The altered anticoagulant dosage she'd documented, the one Caldwell thought he'd erased from the record, was doing exactly what he'd calculated it would do. The general's blood was now thinner than water, his body unable to form clots, his vessel walls weeping without ceasing. Pressure dropping, the anesthesiologist called out, voice level but carrying the undercurrent of alarm. BP 70/40 and falling. Caldwell's hands fumbled. Sarah saw it in the way his fingers hesitated over the clamps, the momentary disconnect between his brain's commands and his body's execution. He was frozen. Not moving, but not quite still, hovering uselessly over the open wound like a puppeteer who'd suddenly forgotten which strings to pull. His confident surgeon's mask was cracking, the facade splitting at the edges to reveal something pale and panicked underneath. The monitors screamed. The heart monitor's flatline wail cut through the gallery's soundproofed silence and somehow reached Sarah anyway, bypassing the glass and the insulation and every barrier between her and the reality unfolding 6 feet away. The general's heart had stopped. Not slowing. Not arrhythmic. Stopped. The man she'd been assigned to protect, the 6-year-old boy she'd pulled from Bagram rubble 2 decades ago, was dying on a table with a surgeon standing over him who couldn't remember how to save him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Stand down. Mission priority. The text from her handler, the chain of command materializing between her and action, the institutional weight of classified protocols pressing against her chest. They wanted her to watch. They wanted her to remain undercover, to preserve the assignment, to let the catastrophe unfold and document it as evidence for whatever intelligence operation had justified putting her here in the first place. This was the test, probably. The moment that separated officers from operatives, the ones who followed orders from the ones who broke them. But through the glass, she saw the general's face. Saw the man and, beneath him, the boy, eyes open, eyes trusting, eyes that had looked up at her from under collapsed concrete in Bagram as gunfire hammered against the remaining walls, eyes that had never forgotten the hands that lifted him out of that darkness. Sarah moved. The observation gallery door burst open and she was through it, her movements economical and precise, the kind of motion that attracts no attention because it carries complete authority. 2 strides down the corridor. The surgical suite doors opened to her touch because she didn't hesitate at them, didn't ask them, simply expected them to yield. The nurses at the prep table glanced up in surprise but didn't stop her. She was moving like someone who belonged exactly where she was going. You need to step back, Sarah said to Caldwell, her voice Arctic calm, the temperature of a frozen lake at midnight. 10 words, delivered in a tone that made every person in the room understand she was not making a request. Caldwell stared at her, his mouth open, blood darkening the cuffs of his gown. Security, he shouted, because that was the only tool he had left, the only way to make the world obey him. Get this nurse out of my surgical suite. But Sarah was already at the table. The general's chest was open, a left anterior lateral thoracotomy, the surgical field a landscape of catastrophe. His heart lay motionless in its cavity, a dark fist refusing to pump. The suction was still running, still pulling at the blood, but there was too much of it, blood moving faster than fluid could escape, the body's own chemistry turned against itself. 90 seconds. That's what she had before neurological death became permanent, before the brain began its cascade of cellular death that no technology could reverse. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for Caldwell to move, didn't wait for protocols to materialize, didn't wait for anyone to authorize what her hands were already doing. Muscle memory took over. The kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from simulation or textbooks, the kind that comes from a forward operating base in Kandahar province where a 19-year-old lance corporal had taught her how to do open cardiac massage using nothing but a headlamp and the absolute certainty that the alternative to trying was someone's child staying dead. She reached into the chest cavity. Her gloved fingers found the heart and began direct cardiac massage, compressing the ventricle with the rhythm of someone who had done this before, who had done this when the only other light in the cave was muzzle flashes, who understood that pain was information, and the information right now was that her patient, her general, her boy, was still salvageable if she could just remind his heart how to beat. 1 compression. 2. The tissue beneath her fingertips firm and responsive. 20 seconds. 30. The heart wasn't firing on its own, but it was accepting her compressions, the blood beginning to move again through the general's body because her hands were making it move, her muscles providing the force that his failing organ could no longer generate. 45 seconds. 60. Still no rhythm, the anesthesiologist reported, watching the flat line continue its mockery across the monitor. Continuing compressions. 2 minutes. The room had gone silent except for the ventilator's mechanical breath and the wet sound of Sarah's compressions, the noise of her hands working inside another human's chest. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Her movements were perfect rhythm, perfect pressure, the kind of precision that only comes from understanding that hesitation kills faster than any disease. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. 3 minutes. Her shoulders burned. Her core engaged with every compression. She was breathing in sync with the ventilator, the two of them working in tandem, the machine pushing air into lungs, her hands pushing blood through a stopped heart, the two of them conspiring to keep the general's brain alive long enough for his heart to remember how to work. 3 minutes and 45 seconds. At 4 minutes flat, the heart shuddered. It was the smallest movement, a tremor in the tissue beneath her fingers, so subtle that someone watching from the gallery might have missed it. But Sarah felt it. The heart's own electrical system suddenly woke, suddenly remembered what it was supposed to do, suddenly fired with the determination of an organ refusing to surrender. The ventricle contracted. Once. Twice. The monitor beeped. Then again. And again. The flat line transformed into waves, the rhythm returning, the heart resuming its ancient work as if it had only been napping, as if it hadn't just spent 4 minutes dead. The general's chest rose and fell with the ventilator's breath, and Sarah removed her hands from his cavity, stepping back from the table with the same composure she'd brought to the moment of arrival. The surgical suite was silent except for the monitors. Caldwell's face was a study in the transformation from panic to calculation. His pale shock was already hardening into something else, the look of a man who had just realized that the witness to his murder had saved his victim, that the nurse he'd mocked had done what his trembling hands could not, and that this disaster could be weaponized into her destruction. Sarah saw the exact moment his brain shifted gears, saw the calculation bloom behind his eyes like something malevolent taking root in rich soil. "Get her out of my suite," he said quietly, his voice steady now, the panic repackaged into controlled malice. "Immediately. This is a protocol violation of the highest order." She performed procedures outside her scope of practice. This entire surgical field is now compromised. His attending physicians exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. "The patient is stabilizing," the anesthesiologist said carefully. "Heart rate 88, rhythm regular, BP climbing. 82/50. "I don't care," Caldwell said, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "She broke protocol. I want this documented. Every second she was in this room. Every hand movement. Everything. This nurse will be reported to the state medical board. She will lose her license. And if this general doesn't survive the next hour, when the complications from her intervention show up, she'll lose a great deal more." Sarah turned and walked out of the surgical suite. She moved through the corridor the same way she'd entered it, with complete authority, with the kind of composure that tells the world you are exactly where you're supposed to be and you've done exactly what needed doing. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, blood roaring in her ears, but her breathing remained controlled, her steps remained measured, her face remained a mask of professional detachment. She'd just saved the general's life. And she'd just given Dr. Caldwell everything he needed to destroy hers. The chest compressions needed to stop. Sarah's hands came away slick, and she stepped back from the table with the calm of someone who had done battlefield surgery in caves with nothing but a headlamp and morphine tablets. For minutes. The general's sinus rhythm returned at exactly the 4-minute mark, not because of luck, but because her hands had remembered every combat medical course, every training scenario, every moment of muscle memory that lived in her fingertips. The monitor climbed. 72. Stable. His color improved. Pink returned to his lips. Sarah peeled off the surgical gloves one finger at a time, precise movements, controlled breath, and turned toward the instrument tray to begin cleanup. That was when Dr. Caldwell stepped back from the table. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He simply pulled off his gloves with deliberate slowness, let them fall into the biohazard bin, and walked directly to the wall phone mounted outside the OR doors. Sarah heard his voice through the surgical suite intercom, calm and measured as a blade sliding into a sheath. "Jim, it's Richard. The hospital president. Of course. We have a situation. A nurse just performed open cardiac surgery without authorization. Yes. No, I couldn't stop her in time. We need to move on this immediately." The words landed in Sarah's chest like shrapnel, and for the first time in 20 years of undercover work, she felt the mission slipping through her fingers like blood down a drain. She continued working. Hand steady. Jaw clenched so tight her back molars ached, but her face remained blank, her movements precise as a metronome. The general was stable. The immediate threat had passed. But Caldwell had just handed her the noose and was already measuring it for length. Within an hour, Caldwell had activated his network with the precision of a man who had spent 18 months building exactly this kind of insurance. He called 3 board members personally, the anesthesiologist he'd given surgical privileges to, the finance director whose daughter went to private school on Caldwell's consulting fees, and the chief nursing officer who had approved his department budget expansion. Each call was the same, a concerned colleague reporting a concerning incident. Each call planted the same seed: liability. Risk. The need for swift institutional action. Then he contacted Sarah's nursing school references. Not all of them. Just the 3 he'd researched carefully, the ones he'd discovered through LinkedIn held administrative positions or had connections to hospital accreditation boards. The conversations were masterpieces of insinuation. "We're reviewing some concerning patterns in her charting," he'd say. "Nothing definitive yet, but we're being thorough. Have you ever noticed anything unusual about her work ethic? Any patterns of deviation from protocol?" The implied threat hung unspoken: answer carefully, or become complicit in her misconduct. By 6 a.m., an outside consultant had been flown in from San Francisco, a surgical review specialist whose firm charged $8,500 a day and who had never met Sarah Chen in her life. He arrived with fresh coffee and a tired expression, carrying a briefcase containing contracts that guaranteed non-disclosure and maximum urgency. Caldwell walked him directly to a private office on the 4th floor and handed him a folder thick with Sarah's charts, her procedure notes, her incident reports from the past 18 months. "Look for deviations," Caldwell instructed. "Anything that suggests she's operating outside her scope. And do it fast. We need documentation for the board meeting this afternoon." The consultant didn't need deviations to find. He needed a paycheck and a simple instruction, and Caldwell had given him both. The consultant spent 3 hours reviewing 23 months of charts, made 17 notes highlighting inconsistencies, and prepared a preliminary report recommending immediate termination pending investigation. By 8 a.m., Sarah sat in a 3rd-floor HR office facing a woman named Patricia Dunmore, the hospital's chief human resources officer, who avoided eye contact the way people avoid looking at car accidents. The termination letter lay on the desk between them, the words printed in 12-point Times New Roman: termination of employment for performing procedures outside scope of practice. The general was in cardiac arrest, Sarah said quietly. He would have been dead in 4 minutes. That may be true, Patricia replied, still not meeting her eyes. But the protocols exist for a reason, Ms. Chen. If any nurse, regardless of intent, performs procedures beyond their scope of practice. Is that what this is about? Protocol. The door opened. Dr. Caldwell stepped inside, and his presence changed the room's air pressure like a weather system moving in. He didn't sit. he stood with his arms crossed, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a man who had just successfully executed a plan that had taken 18 months to construct. "The General's life is not your concern anymore," he said smoothly. "You're relieved of duty effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The words arrived like a verdict from a judge who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. Sarah's badge was confiscated at the HR desk. Her locker was emptied by a security guard who handled her belongings as if they might detonate. The worn combat boots, the gift from the child she'd pulled from rubble in Bagram, the child who had just been saved by her own hands, went into a cardboard box along with her stethoscope, her name tag, her spare scrubs folded with military precision. 18 months of carefully maintained cover, 18 months of undercover assessment and classified reporting, 18 months of watching the General recover and planning how to confirm whether his accident had truly been assassination, all of it gone in the time it took Caldwell to make 4 phone calls. The mission was compromised. Losing access to the General before she could file her final report meant losing the ability to confirm whether Caldwell's sabotage had been personal, financial, or part of something larger. Sarah had evidence of the altered medication charts, photographic proof of the pre-surgery anticoagulant injection that would have left no trace post-mortem. But without continued hospital access, without being able to monitor the General's condition and cross-reference Caldwell's actions against any larger institutional pattern, the case remained incomplete. Her classified handlers would want more. They always wanted more. Sarah walked to the laundry return window on the ground floor in the late morning light that came through the hospital's eastern windows. The weight of the cardboard box pressed against her ribs, and for just a moment, a single moment that lasted 3 seconds, she allowed her shoulders to sag under it. Then her spine straightened. Her breathing normalized. The mask came back into place. She stood at the counter where she'd checked out thousands of items over 18 months. The laundry attendant, a woman named Margaret who'd worked there for 12 years, watched uncomfortably as Sarah began folding her scrubs one last time. Navy blue. White trim. The fabric still warm from her last shift. Sarah creased each edge with parade ground precision, the same precision she'd used on hotel linens in Kandahar, the same muscle memory that had guided her hands through an open chest cavity. 7 folds. 1 stack. She placed the folded items on the counter, signed the return form, and walked away. Her limp was barely visible today, though the phantom pain from the shrapnel wound in her left thigh radiated heat like a warning beacon. She had been limping through Seattle General for months without anyone noticing. The small imperfections made people look away. They made her invisible. That was the point. Sarah waited in the hospital lobby for her exit interview, the final piece of the termination process. She checked her phone. No messages from her classified handlers. No extraction orders. No instructions. Just silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above her head, and somewhere in the building, the General lay in recovery from cardiac arrest, alive because she had broken her cover to save him, and now she was being led toward the door like a problem that had solved itself. That was when the elevator ding sounded, and a gurney emerged. A man lay strapped to it, dark hair matted with sweat, shoulders muscled like a boxer's, and his eyes were fixed on Sarah's face with the intensity of someone who had seen a ghost. The medical team wheeled him quickly toward the emergency surgical wing, but his head twisted, straining against the restraints, and he began screaming in Pashto. His voice cracked with terror and something else, recognition. Recognition of a ghost he'd thought was dead. A ghost that had walked through fire. Jinn! Jinn! The Jinn of Bagram. His finger pointed at Sarah with a trembling hand. The ghost who walks through fire. The one who carries soldiers through rubble. The lobby erupted. Nurses turned. Doctors stopped walking. The security guard stationed near the north entrance, a Navy veteran with weathered hands and 20 years of service behind his eyes, went rigid at attention. His voice rang out across the lobby with the crispness of a formation call. Master Chief on deck. The moment fractured like glass under pressure. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen, his small smile evaporating. His hand, which had been reaching for the elevator button, dropped to his side. His eyes moved from the screaming patient to Sarah, then back, then to Sarah again, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his face. The general's attending physician, Dr. Martinez, emerged from the emergency stairwell holding a tablet, her face pale as hospital walls. She pushed through the crowd gathering in the lobby, nurses, doctors, administrators magnetized by the disturbance. Her voice shook as she addressed the crowd, though everyone could see her eyes were fixed on Sarah. "I made a call," she said. "After what happened in surgery, I requested her actual service record. It just came through from the Pentagon." The tablet glowed in her hands, and she began reading aloud, each word landing with the weight of an ordnance detonation. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. A pause. 3 silver stars. Another pause, longer this time, as the significance settled over the room like snow. 2 bronze stars with V device. The crowd began to understand. This wasn't a nurse. This was a legend. Navy Cross. Caldwell's breathing became audible, ragged, desperate, the sound of a man realizing he had just attempted to destroy something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. 2 tours as a Special Forces medic, Dr. Martinez continued, her voice steady now, authoritative, embedded with Army units throughout Afghanistan. Transition to naval intelligence. Specialization, medical facility infiltration and fraud investigation. The words hung in the lobby air like dust after an explosion, and no one moved. No one breathed. The Taliban commander continued screaming, but his voice became background noise to the silence that filled the space where Dr. Caldwell's certainty had been a moment before. Then the elevator ding sounded again, and everyone's attention shifted toward the opening doors. The general emerged in a wheelchair, pushed slowly by a nurse, his muscular frame diminished by injury but his presence still commanding. Tears streamed down his face, not from pain, but from recognition. His hands trembled as he held up a communication board, the blue screen glowing in the morning light, and he pressed keys with one finger that moved like it was translating the weight of 20 years. The board's mechanical speaker announced each word in a synthetic voice that somehow made them more powerful, not less. "She carried me through fire when I was 6. His finger moved again, slower this time, as if the effort of remembering might break him. Bagram. 2004, 3 miles. She took shrapnel meant for me. Another pause. Another keystroke. I looked for her for 20 years. He continued, his finger moving with deliberate precision. This woman is why I became a soldier. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The general's finger continued across the communication board, each letter deliberate, each word a hammer blow. She carried me through fire when I was 6. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the doors burst open. A Navy veteran security guard, call sign Breaker, 22 years active duty, went rigid at the entrance, his hand moving to his radio before he even fully processed what he was hearing. His eyes locked on Sarah, standing motionless in the corner, her face composed as granite. "Master Chief on deck," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had served under classified operators. His hand moved to his chest in a salute, crisp and reverent. The resident scattered backward like fish scattering from a shark. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of color. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, producing no sound. The general's attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, who had spent the last 6 hours believing Sarah was just another night shift nurse with a hero complex, turned to face her slowly, as if seeing her for the first time. He pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands. "I'm pulling your classified file," he said, his voice barely audible. "Give me 60 seconds. He scrolled, his eyes widening with each line. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave. 3 silver stars. Bronze star with V for Valor. 2 purple hearts. Master Chief Petty Officer Chen. 12 years active duty. 2 tours as Special Forces medic. 8 additional tours with naval intelligence. Top secret SCI clearance. He looked at her like she was someone he'd walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing. You saved how many lives in theater? Sarah's jaw clenched, barely perceptible. That's classified. The file says, Dr. Webb's voice cracked. 4,847 documented saves. Combat medicine. Trauma surgery in field conditions. You trained a medical response team that operates in 3 countries. He lowered his phone, his hand steady now but his eyes wet. You've been working night shifts here for what, 3 years? While that, he jerked his chin toward Caldwell, who was backing toward the exit with the fluid panic of a man watching his life collapse in real time, while that man has been billing phantom procedures. The hospital president appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. Someone had called him. Someone had told him to get to ICU immediately. He stood frozen, watching as a decorated military operative, someone his golf buddy had just fired without cause, stood in the center of the room surrounded by proof that Dr. Caldwell had made the worst professional decision of his life. She saved my life, the general typed, his finger moving slower now, each word still a monumental effort through his paralyzed throat. When I couldn't save myself. When no one else could reach me. She came through fire. The attending physician's phone rang. Then another's. Then another. 5 phones chiming simultaneously with notification sounds like a digital alarm clock. Marcus, the resident who had mimicked Sarah's accent at the vending machines, whose laughter had echoed off the hospital walls while Caldwell smirked, pulled his phone from his pocket and his entire body went rigid. "Oh no," he whispered. "Oh God, oh no, no, no." "What?" Dr. Webb demanded. "The video," Marcus breathed. "The video is everywhere." The hospital president stepped forward, his face still processing. "What video?" Marcus turned his phone around. The screen showed crystal clear footage, shot from someone's phone mounted in the corner of the break room, of Dr. Caldwell at grand rounds, his voice dripping contempt as he held up Sarah's patient care documentation. The Chen protocol, he had called it, his tone making clear the insult embedded in those words. Dangerous deviation from protocol. Reckless. Unnecessary. And then the vending machine footage, Marcus mimicking her accent while Caldwell's shoulders shook with laughter, while 3 other residents joined in, while Sarah stood there collecting her coffee with a steadiness that now seemed like the composure of someone who had held dying men's hands in desert caves. The caption beneath the video was brutal in its simplicity: "This is how Seattle General treats a decorated war hero. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, 3 silver stars, 2 tours as Special Forces medic, saved this man's life yesterday." Dr. Caldwell's response, mockery. 200,000 views within an hour. 300 by lunch. 500,000 by mid-afternoon, spreading across Reddit, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter like wildfire, each share adding fuel. News outlets picked it up. Local Atlanta channels. National morning shows. The story wrote itself: brilliant operative, hidden identity, incompetent administrator, video proof of his cruelty, the general's revelation waiting to explode across every platform. By 2:38 p.m., the call came from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond, the legendary trauma surgeon, the one whose recommendation letter had launched Caldwell's entire career, the mentor who had called him her spiritual son at his wedding, had seen the video. She had watched it 3 times in her office overlooking the Baltimore harbor, her hands trembling not with age but with the fury of someone who had been betrayed. That evening, the Journal of the American Medical Association published her editorial. The title alone was a death blow: "When We Fail to See Heroes Among Us, a Mentor's Confession and Repudiation." The piece was methodical, surgical in its precision. Hammond dismantled Caldwell's character in 4,000 carefully chosen words. She withdrew her endorsement of his career. She called for investigation into his surgical judgment. She disclosed confidential information about previous complaints that had been quietly settled. She named the 3 board members who had accepted kickbacks. She exposed the phantom procedures stretching back 18 months. By evening, federal auditors arrived at Seattle General. Not the scheduled quarterly audit, emergency investigation. They found everything Sarah had been documenting with her meticulous charting, inflated billing codes totaling $847,000, phantom procedures, kickbacks split between Caldwell and 3 board members amounting to $250,000 in personal enrichment. The evidence was airtight. Criminal referral forwarded to the Atlanta FBI field office within 24 hours. Caldwell's hospital access was revoked at midnight. His surgical privileges terminated. His license flagged for investigation. The 3 board members resigned and lawyered up, facing charges that would carry federal sentencing guidelines. The hospital president announced a full independent review of all procedures performed by Caldwell over the preceding 5 years. 3 major medical journals retracted papers bearing his name when co-authors discovered methodology inconsistencies that suggested fabricated data. His career didn't end. It combusted. The flame burned hot and bright for exactly 72 hours, then extinguished completely, leaving only ash and a permanent notation in the medical licensing database, terminated for ethical violations and fraud. 6 months later, on a Tuesday that Sarah had reserved for community outreach with her new position as Director of Veteran Services at Seattle General, she walked through a strip mall in suburban Atlanta. The sun was hot on her shoulders, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Her left leg ached slightly, the old Kandahar wound, the one that had healed crooked, but the limp was barely visible anymore, just a slight favor in her gait, something most people wouldn't notice. She passed a narrow storefront with a folding table visible through the front window. Supplemental insurance, affordable rates. The sign was printed on white cardstock, taped to the glass with yellowed tape. Dr. Caldwell sat behind that table, alone, his shirt rumpled and sweat-stained despite the air conditioning visible through the vents. His desk was neat in the way of someone with nothing to do, brochures stacked with obsessive precision, pens arranged by color, a phone that hadn't rung in weeks. His face, once carved with the confidence of institutional power, had collapsed inward. He'd aged a decade in 6 months. Their eyes met through the glass. Recognition flooded his features first, the terrible instant where he understood exactly who was walking past his storefront. Then shame, deep and consuming and written across his face like a confession, pulled his shoulders down and made him look like a man who understood he'd spent his entire life climbing the wrong mountain. Sarah didn't break stride. Her composed face remained fixed forward. Her feet carried her past the window without pause, past the folding table, past the broken man who had tried to destroy her and discovered instead that he had been trying to destroy someone the world was far more invested in protecting than he understood. That evening, in her new office at Seattle General's newly created Veteran Services Division, Sarah placed the worn combat boots on the shelf above her desk. The leather was cracked, the laces stained with things she'd never bothered to clean out, blood, sand, dust from 1,000 hostile patrols. She positioned them carefully next to a framed photograph that had arrived that morning, delivered by courier from the General's rehabilitation facility. In the photograph, the General sat upright in his hospital bed, and for the first time since his injury, since he'd become mute, since his body had betrayed him in the wreckage of an IED blast in Kandahar, he was smiling. A real smile, teeth visible, his eyes alive with something that looked like hope. Sarah was standing beside him in dress blues, her hand moving toward his shoulder, and he was reaching for her hand in return. Their fingers were intertwined, 2 survivors who had found each other across 20 years and 3 continents. A medal hung from a ribbon in the General's other hand, his Medal of Honor, awarded for valor, for leadership under fire, for refusing to leave his people behind. The photograph captured the instant Sarah had pinned the medal to his hospital gown, the moment his eyes had met hers and something unsaid had passed between them. Understanding. Recognition. The knowledge that what they had shared in that rubble-strewn compound in Bagram all those years ago had mattered, had shaped both their lives, had made them who they were. Below the frame, Sarah had placed a small bronze plaque with words engraved in precise letters, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." Her office phone rang at 6:14 p.m. as she was closing her laptop for the evening. The number was from the VA Benefits Hotline. Another veteran, this one a Marine with catastrophic TBI, whose disability case had been denied twice and who needed someone who understood both military culture and bureaucratic procedure. Someone who had seen the worst and knew how to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Sarah picked up on the second ring, her voice steady and warm, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded men in combat but also the compassion of someone who understood that sometimes the real battle happened in waiting rooms and processing centers. Veteran Services. This is Master Chief Chen. What do we need to fix? The caller's breath caught at the title. At the voice. At the knowledge that someone with that rank, someone who had clearly seen things, done things, sacrificed things, was now dedicated to helping people like him navigate the maze of the system. The combat boots watched over Sarah's work from their shelf, their worn leather holding 20 years of stories, their blood-stained laces a reminder that some rescues take a lifetime to complete. And in the framed photograph beside them, the general smiled, finally, after years of silence, finally smiling again, because sometimes the warrior who saves you isn't the one with the gun. Sometimes it's the one with steady hands and a quiet voice, willing to carry you through fire for 20 years until you're ready to smile again. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of heroes hidden in plain sight, people whose greatest strength was never about what they could destroy but about who they could save. Like this video, comment below with a time you were underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when ordinary people reveal themselves as extraordinary.